So you're just chilling on the couch, doing what you do, and you're scrolling through YouTube, and you're seeing videos of people talking about how bad seed oils are for you, and they accelerate your chance of heart disease, and this and that. And then you're finding videos of people saying that they're good for you, and they're better for you than things like beef tallow, and duck fat, and olive oil. And you're sitting there and you're thinking, well, both scenarios can't be true. So, what is it? Are seed oils good for you, or are they bad for you? Well, let's talk about it on today's episode of The Science Behind That.
Welcome to The Science Behind That with Atticus Hamilton.
Hello, all you scientists, and welcome on back to The Science Behind That podcast. I'm your host, Atticus Hamilton, and as you heard in the intro, today we're going to be discussing the science behind seed oils. I know seed oils have come into, the mainstream focus recently with RFK leading Health and Human Services here in America, and then that spurring on all different types of conversations about seed oils, both here and in the U.S. and abroad. And today we're going to be talking about them. We're going to be going through what seed oils are, how they're made, and we're going to compare that with olive oil, duck fat, and beef tallow. And we're also going to be talking about what the health effects are of seed oils, which will lead us into if it's better than the alternatives. And of course, then we'll finish off with a nice summary of everything that we learned today. Before we get into it, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite all of you to go grab yourselves a nice steaming hot cup of coffee, add a little bit of maple syrup to it, and we will jump right into today's episode. Well, welcome back, everybody, to the Friday episode. I hope all of you guys are having a wonderful Friday. I know I am. And in fact, by the time you guys hear this, I will be on a plane heading over to the East Coast for a little bit of holiday. But I hope that I can entertain you here for the next 30 minutes or so with today's episode about seed oils. So before we jump into today's episode, I want to put this up front here, especially because YouTube, for whatever reason, when I do these nutrition-based videos, has a tendency to take down my episodes. So if for those of you who find my podcast on YouTube, if you're ever unsure if I've uploaded a new episode, go check out Spotify, go check out iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, Amazon. My podcast is pretty much everywhere, and I know that with a couple of my episodes, YouTube has taken them down for some reason, unfortunately. So if that happens, or if you're uncertain if I have a new episode, go and take a look at the other platforms. Additionally, as we go into today's episode, it seems like, as with many things these days, this topic has become a very politicized topic. So when we're talking today, it's just going to be the straight science, but I will talk about some things that have caused contention with people, and as I'm sure many of you know, this has become a very political issue, unfortunately. But let's jump right in. So what is a seed oil? Well, a seed oil is an oil that comes from a seed. Duh, right? But seed oils are different than... They are a class of vegetable oil, but they're different from something like olive oil. Olive oil comes from the meat of the olive, right? And so when we're making olive oil, producers will take a bunch of fresh olives, wash them off, and then cold press them. They'll put them in a big press, basically, and it'll just squeeze the oil out of the tissue of the olive. Seed oils, on the other hand, are oils that are explicitly extracted from the seeds of various plants. So these include your canola oil, your corn oil, cottonseed oil, soybean oil, sunflower oil, safflower oil, grapeseed oil, and rice bran oil. And these are the 8 most infamous, if you will. And as some people on social media call them, the Hateful Eight, which I think is just funny. But those are the main types of seed oils out there. So we now know what they are, right? How are they made? Well, seed oils can be made in one of 2 ways. They can either be mechanically extracted or chemically extracted. Mechanical extraction is rarer, and usually when in a seed oil has been mechanically extracted when it's unrefined seed oil, and that's usually what it would be called. And within the oil, you have little bits of nuts and seeds and that sort of stuff typically as well. But the primary way they are extracted is chemically. And so what does that look like? So the factory receives a bunch of seeds. Let's say they're sunflower seeds, right? They're washed to remove any impurities, and then they are baked. Usually they'll be baked, and then after they're baked, they'll be de-seeded or pulverized, and then they'll be pressed. And when they're pressed, then that crude oil that comes out of it, that can be packaged as unrefined seed oils. Most of the time, however, that doesn't happen. So usually what will happen is they'll be pressed, or they won't be pressed at all, and that oil will be taken and it will be boiled. It will be boiled and then mixed with hexane, and that will remove any extra oil from the bits of leftover seeds that are in that vat. And then the hexane will be boiled off because it has a lower boiling point than the oil does, and then the oil will be filtered, and then there you go. The other way to do it is after baking and deshelling the seeds will be mixed in a vat of, again, typically hexane. Hexane is used because it's very, very efficient at removing the oil from the seeds. Then the hexane will remove the oil from the seeds, right? And then again, they'll probably press those seeds down again and extract out as much as they possibly can. And then you have this vat of oil and hexane that are mixed together. That is heated, and the hexane evaporates off, and you're left with the oil. And then usually that's left to cool, filtered, heated again, and then the hexane, any residual hexane, hopefully, again boils off, and then it's filtered and then packaged and ready to go. For the most part, in a very abridged sense, that's how seed oils are produced. Now, if we compare this to like olive oil, it's really simple. Olive oil, if it's high quality olive oil, if it's extra virgin cold pressed olive oil, you'll just take the olives and put them in a press, and they'll press out the oil, and then any large particulate will be filtered out and it will be packaged and sent off to the supermarkets. And then duck fat is made in a even easier process. Usually the birds are just cooked and rendered down, and the process of getting duck fat in a liquid form out of the duck is called rendering. And duck fat is considered one of the healthiest cooking fats you can use because it has a very similar monounsaturated fatty acid profile to that of olive oil, which is also another healthy oil. But anyway, that's basically how that works for duck fat. So olive oil is pressed, the olives are pressed to produce the oil, and then ducks are rendered down to produce the oil, and that's pretty much it for that as well. Okay, so considering this then, I guess, your next question would be, well, Atticus, if you're using solvents to remove the oil from the seeds, is there any hexane left over? Well, in all honesty, we don't really know, because the FDA, at least here in America, the FDA does not monitor or regulate hexane residue in cooking oils. So we basically just rely on the good graces of the companies that produce them to ensure that there are no lethal levels or harmful levels of hexane in the cooking oils. And to make matters even more complex, the United States doesn't actually even have any guidelines on the maximum amount of hexane that is allowed to be in items for human consumption. The EU does, however, and that's around 1 part per million. So in the EU, there can only be 1 or less part per million of hexane in anything that's meant for human consumption. Now, why is that, right? The hexane is very toxic. And I was looking at an article here. I'm not going to say who it's from because I don't want to get emails from them. But it was an article titled Seed Oils, Facts versus Myth. And in the article, they talk about how hexane is deadly or is toxic as a gas, but that it's used as a liquid solvent, implying that it's not toxic as a liquid, which is not accurate. Hexane is toxic as a liquid and as a gas. Sorry, I had to take a sip of my coffee there. It is. And in fact, hexane can cause a variety of effects. It causes severe neurological effects. In mild cases, it causes nausea, vomiting, confusion, headache. But in more severe cases, it can cause permanent nerve damage, affecting the feet, legs, hands, and arms. And under chronic long-term exposure to hexane, it can cause muscle atrophy and paralysis. Now, it is worth noting here that these obviously would be in high concentrations, and definitely higher concentrations than 1 part per million. But the simple fact of the matter is that because the FDA does not monitor or regulate hexane residue in honestly in many things meant for human consumption, it's tough to say what levels are actually in cooking oils. And as a result as well, there's really no data on, what does the long-term chronic exposure of hexane in levels of 1 part per million or 10 parts per million do to the human body, because that would be also an unethical study. But there's no data in terms of that. There's just data in terms of what hexane does to the human body. And most likely, when it comes to seed oils in America, there would most likely be hexane residue there, because there's hexane residue in decaffeinated coffee. And for those of you who have been followers of my podcast for a while, I did an episode on decaffeinated coffee and how, unless it's done using the Swiss water method, which just uses water, there's hexane residue and other solvent residue on the coffee. So that's one potential health effect is the risk that you can run into with the with hexane residue that may or may not be left over in the oils. So other than hexane, there is one other potential health risk of seed oils. And for those of you listening who are familiar with the discussions on seed oils, I'm not going to say omega-6s and omega-3s. Omega-6s and 3s have valid and proven health benefits. And I'm also not going to say the ratio of omega-6s to omega-3s, because I know people who are against seed oils sometimes talk about that as an issue. Omega-6 and omega-3 is good. It's something that has been shown to benefit circulatory health, which is why algae oil and fish oil are very beneficial to heart health. I take algae oil every day, which contains omega-6, omega-3, EPA, and DHA. But no, the other, which in my opinion, the greater health risk, greater than hexane, with seed oils is the simple fact that there's trans fats in them. Now, for those of you who know what trans fats are, I'm sure some of you right now are probably typing an email. Well, Atticus, trans fat was made illegal in the United States in 2017, and seed oils contain mono and polyunsaturated fats. How can they contain trans fats? They can contain trans fats because there is a point with any oil where you create trans fats involuntarily, and that's called the smoke point. I cook with a cast iron pan a lot, and when you cook with cast iron, the first thing you do when you get a new pan is to put olive oil in there, heat it up to the smoke point, and wipe it out. Why? Because it coats the inside of the pan with a layer of trans fat, basically, that sticks to the pan, doesn't wear off, it sticks to the pan and creates a non-stick surface. The same thing happens when you're refining seed oils. If you remember earlier when we were talking about how they're made, I mentioned that there's several processes of heating and cooling. Those processes of heating and cooling will heat parts of that vat of seed oil up to the smoke point of the oil and create trans fats. Now, is your level 50-50, right? Absolutely not. But you could expect in some brands, and some studies have demonstrated this, that you can have as high as 3% trans fat in a container of seed oils, simply because of the process of refining it to remove the hexane. So what that means is, if you do use seed oils, it would be advisable to look for some that are unrefined seed oils that are simply pressed, and use those instead, because greater than the hexane issue is the issue of trans fats that are simply created due to the heating and cooling process of that vat of seed oil during the refining process. Now, for those of you who don't know what trans fats are saturated fatty acids that are artificially created. They generally don't exist by themselves in nature, at least not in the same conformation as dietary trans fats do. They're saturated with hydrogens, but they possess a double bond, so they have a kink in the phospholipid tail. Trans fats are objectively one of the worst substances you can ingest, because what they do is numerous studies have demonstrated that trans fats raise levels of LDL cholesterol, which is bad cholesterol, and decrease HDL cholesterol, which is good cholesterol. And the other thing they do as well is trans fats, through a variety of biochemical mechanisms, actually reduce LDL particle size in a dose-dependent manner. So the more trans fat you consume, the smaller and smaller those LDL particles are going to become. And for those of you who've listened to my episode on sugar and saturated fat, there's two types of LDL. There's SB, small buoyant LDL, and LD-LDL, which is large dense LDL. Small buoyant LDL is the worst for you, because what happens with that is it precipitates out of the blood, and when it does that, your macrophages consume that LDL and convert into foam cells, and foam cells are immobile, and then your immune system treats that as a pathogenic threat and walls it off, creating plaques, also known as atherosclerosis. And trans fats greatly accelerate that process. So, saturated fats, for the most part, aren't that bad for you. And I did an entire episode on that in case you're curious. Poly and monounsaturated fats aren't bad for you. They're good for you. Trans fats are. And if there's anything you reduce from your diet, it should be trans fats. So in my opinion, as a certified nutrition coach, and as a prospective physician, and as a microbiologist, the biggest issue with seed oils is not the hexane residue, it's the fact that there's trans fats there. So that leads us then into if it's actually better than alternatives, I would say no. I would say that seed oils, there's a lot of risk, especially considering that seed oils were first created in 1911 with Crisco. Um, Crisco was the first seed oil thing that was created. It was created in 1911 by Procter and Gamble, and it was cottonseed oil that was ultra processed and refined. And is it actually better? Not really. I mean, in all honesty, you're gonna get a more complete mono and polyunsaturated fat profile from olive oil and duck fat. So I'd say between the two, go and use olive oil and or duck fat. For those of you out there who are maybe vegetarian or vegan and you don't want to eat duck fat, do olive oil, because you have a much lower risk of consuming trans fats with olive oil, as long as you don't overcook it past its smoke point, and you have no risk of hexane. And so I think that overall seed oils don't outweigh or they're not better than the alternatives. And it's a real problem because pretty much all of our ultra processed foods out there have seed oils in them. And as consumers, if you go to the grocery store, I was at the grocery store today and I saw frozen waffles by Kodiak Cakes, and I like their waffle batter. They're great, but I looked on the back of the waffles and there was sunflower oil and canola oil and linseed oil in there. And the problem with that is you don't know if those were chemically refined or mechanically refined. And if you have the ability to choose between chemically refined seed oil and mechanically refined seed oil, go mechanical, because then you don't have the risk of hexane. You still may have the risk of trans fats, but you don't have the risk of hexane if you go mechanical or unrefined seed oils. And the reason seed oils are added into all these ultra processed foods is simply because they're cheap and they're very good at providing texture and preserving food items. But overall, ladies and gentlemen, I advocate against seed oils or against processed foods in general. And that's not to say there are no benefits from seed oils. There certainly are. A lot of them contain a lot of good phytonutrients, assuming that those weren't destroyed during the heating and cooling processes. And they do contain omega-3s and 6s, which are good for you. It's just the risk of hexane residue and trans fat especially is a big concern. So overall, ladies and gentlemen, in summary, seed oils are oils from seeds, right? They're oils from seeds that are typically extracted using chemical solvents, but can be extracted mechanically. They're made through solvent and or mechanical extraction procedures, compared to their counterparts like beef tallow and duck fat, which are simply rendered out of the meat, and then olive oil, which is simply pressed out of the olives. And overall, while seed oils do possess beneficial omega-3s and 6s, they also possess trans fats, and here in America, they may also possess hexane residue, which is not good either. So overall, ladies and gentlemen, after all this, my advice would be, if you're on the fence about it, stick to olive oil and duck fat if you can. And if you can't do duck fat or beef tallow as well, just stick to olive oil. Olive oil, you don't have the risk of trans fats, again, unless you heat them up to past their smoke point, which would give you very, very overcooked meat, or whatever you're cooking with it. And you don't have a risk of hexane or harsh chemical solvents. There was once a day So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Let me know what you think. You can send me an email at thesciencebt@gmail.com, or you can send me a text message using the link down below wherever you're listening to this podcast. And for my YouTube audience, if this appeared on YouTube, let me know. I'd love to know, and if you ended up going to any of the other platforms, let me know as well. I hope all of you have a fantastic weekend, ladies and gentlemen. I will see you all on Monday, and remember, as always, stand up and question everything.
I'm falling fast, sitting here praying that this night's gonna last. You got it all on tap, I'm loving your vibe, always have your back. We like all the same tracks, listen all night.